Good morning. Welcome. It's a Sunday morning, and I didn't expect as many people here. But thank you for taking time out to be with us here today. This demystifying climate change, that is the theme of this morning's session. And that's based on this book, Backstage Climate by Rajan Mehta. Um, I love this book. It is, let me put you, how do I put this? You might find this information in disparate pieces all over in different books. But what Rajan Mehta does is two things. He puts it simply, he puts it together for you. And it is not just science, but also the politics of it. And there are also peeks into human nature as to what will define our behavior on climate change. So thank you for the book, Mr. Mehta. And it's been a great pleasure to have you here. So I was asking him what prompted him to write the book, and it is there in the preface of the book. He has two sons, a son,
A son and
and
a
a daughter,
daughter.
a son and a
Yes.
daughter, and he asked them to paint the sky. He lives between the U.S. and Delhi, as was mentioned here earlier, and he asked them to paint the sky in Delhi, and they painted it gray because they had only seen it gray. So, from a father's perspective, that was pretty shocking, I guess. And I am reminded of this joke in Kochi where they asked school children to draw a chicken, and they drew a roasted chicken, an alfam chicken, because they hadn't seen a real chicken. So this is almost the same way. So thank you for the book, and thanks to your children for the eye opener into it that way. But then we did discuss this earlier, and you did tell me that you you saw climate change also from a problem solving point of view. For our audience, could you elaborate that a little more?
Sure. So I was discussing with Matthew. He asked me just around 10 minutes back that what prompted you to look at climate. And I was sharing with him that I've been an entrepreneur, building up companies. So when you're an entrepreneur, you're always looking around for problems because your DNA is to solve problems. So in that respect, once I saw my children, painting the sky gray, I knew there was a problem, that we needed to solve and make sure that the sky turns blue for them. And that remained in my mind. And, it started from there. And I figured out that the sky is gray in Delhi because of air pollution, right? As I started researching into that, I also figured out that there's a bigger monster called climate change, and I got interested in it and then started delving into it and went ahead and did some research and then got motivated to write the book. So, yeah.
Thank you for that. And then in the book, you do mention that in some form or the other, climate change has always been there. Then what is scary at the moment, or why should we be scared about climate change right now?
Sure. So maybe I'll just explain the why climate change has
Yes.
already always been there, and then come to
Yes.
your question. So if you look at the climatic history of the planet, we've always been going through these cycles where the Earth becomes very warm at one end, and then it almost goes into a frozen state at the other end, right? Uh, and this happens over hundreds of millions of years, right? Now, the way this happens is there are two cycles or two phenomenon that govern this. One is called the orbital cycle, and the other one is called the carbon cycle. The orbital cycle is governed by the revolution of the Earth around the sun and also by its rotation around its own axis, right? And there are three levers. The first one, we could call it the Earth's eccentricity. What it means is that the trajectory that the Earth follows in its revolution around the sun changes from being a perfect circle to an elliptical trajectory. But this happens over every 100,000 years, right? Uh, what the effect it has is that when the Earth is close to the sun, it receives higher amount of sun's energy. And when it's at the elliptical end and far from the sun, it reduces less amount of energy, right? That's the first lever. The second lever is called the Earth's tilt. As we know, the Earth rotates around its own axis, and the axis is tilted. It's tilted at, some degrees, but these the tilt varies, right? It varies from a minimum of 22.1 degrees to a maximum of around 24.6 degrees, right? And this tilt again happens over every 47,000 years, right? The effect of that is that when the tilt is minimum, um, the North Pole receives the lower sun's energy, and also the summers are short, right? What this does is that during the winters, whatever ice or snow falls, because the summers are very short, it doesn't melt, right? So over hundreds of thousands of years, the ice starts accumulating and it draws us into an ice age. And the reverse is also true. When the Earth is far closer to the sun, and also the Earth's tilt is the maximum, and the summers are the longest. So that's how it kind of goes from one end to the other. The other cycle is the carbon cycle. The amount of carbon in the Earth's atmosphere is fixed, and it keeps moving between the biosphere, which is the flora and fauna, uh, and then the geosphere, which is the Earth's crust and the core, the hydrosphere, which is the ocean, and the atmosphere. Uh, for example, when the flora and fauna die, some of the carbon mass goes into the ground, and there it decomposes over millions of years and gets transformed into fossil fuels. And some of the carbon mass also decomposes and goes into the atmosphere. Right? And from the atmosphere, it gets washed down again as carbonic acid. And so I wouldn't go into the details there. But the fact is, the carbon keeps moving, right? When the carbon or its carbon dioxide is the least in the atmosphere, what happens is the Earth's warmth starts getting radiated into the atmosphere, right? And escapes, it becomes cold. As the carbon dioxide starts building up, this heat is retained within the earth because the carbon dioxide and the greenhouse gases go and form a blanket around the earth and prevent the heat from going out. The way this happens is that the earth gets most of its energy from the sun, and the energy comes by way of sunlight, right? And let's say 100 units of energy is coming to light energy is coming to the earth. 30% of it gets reflected back by way of or from white surfaces like the glaciers, the clouds, the white sands, and only 30% really reaches the earth, right? Or sorry, 70% reaches the earth. And this 70% is used by God to operate the mankind. But at the end of the day, uh, every object maintains its energy balance. So whatever excess energy is there, it gets radiated back. And this energy gets radiated back as infrared rays. So you see, the earth gets its energy from the sun by way of light energy or sunlight, but the excess energy is radiated back as infrared rays or thermal energy, heat energy, right? Now, when this energy is getting radiated back, the atmospheric gases like oxygen, nitrogen, which form the majority, let these infrared rays pass transparently, right? But carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases start blocking it, right? They block it because the wavelength at which the electrons are moving and the wavelength of the infrared rays matches. And just like we've learnt in our school physics, our teachers always gave this example that when a column of army guys or military guys are going over a bridge, marching over a bridge, they're always told to break their step, because otherwise their steps start resonating with the frequency of the bridge and the bridge could collapse. So a similar phenomenon happens in greenhouse gases. Because the wavelength of the infrared rays and the electrons is matching, the electrons start moving much faster, get excited, their temperature rises, and that heat gets reflected back and doesn't escape into the atmosphere. That's how the Earth starts getting warmer. To come to your question, now this explains how kind of the climate changes and the global warming is happening. But to come to your question, that why is it different this time? Uh, this time things are on steroids. What we humans have done is we pulled out fossil fuels from the ground and we are combusting them or burning them and putting carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. We've put up a lot of industry, which again is putting carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. We are destroying nature, because of which again a lot of carbon dioxide is getting into the nature. So the amount of carbon dioxide in the nature today is at a very high level. And there are some estimates made that this amount of carbon dioxide was last seen probably 5 to 6 million years back, right? So, because there's so much of carbon dioxide that we are emitting, the blanket, these greenhouse gases have gone and formed a blanket, right, which is kind of keeping the heat inside. And this blanket has become very thick and keeping all the heat inside, right? And it's getting much warmer. And as it is getting warmer, our entire climatic cycle is changing, because climate is based on the distribution of energy from a place where there is excess to a place where there is low energy. So those distribution patterns are getting disturbed, which is what is causing climate change.
Okay. Now, the science about it is clear, and it is also fairly clear about what needs to be done. What do you think is holding back individuals and governments from climate action?
Sure. The first thing is the amount of growth, development, comfort that we humans are used to now, and which has come about in the last, let's say, 200, 300 years, a lot of it has to do with fossil fuels and industry, right? Both of which have been emitting carbon dioxide and, behind the scenes causing climate change, right? None of us is today willing to give up our lifestyle, right? So we don't recognize it as a problem that our actions or our use of fossil fuels or industrial items is what is responsible for climate change, right? Therefore, I'm not willing to give up my lifestyle. You're not willing to. Nobody is. So we think somebody else should give up. So this is a classic collective action problems. It's everyone's problem. Therefore, it becomes no one's problem, right? So nobody's doing anything. We all keep pointing fingers, right? That's one fundamental issue with it. The second is it's also what we call as the tragedy of commons, right? What it means is that if I'm emitting carbon dioxide or any greenhouse gas, it's going up in the atmosphere, mixing and traveling. So my emitting carbon dioxide here or my driving a car here could actually cause a storm in Timbuktu, right? But I, as the perpetrator or emitter of carbon dioxide, I'm not affected. And when I'm not affected directly, I'm not motivated to give up my lifestyle. So if the perpetrator is not the sufferer, then there is no incentive to change, right? So because of this, uh, I'm not motivated to make any changes. So again, everybody is thinking it's somebody else's problem. Let them take care of it, right? Uh, that's on the that's a fundamental issue, right? Another fundamental issue is that there is a time lag between when we take any action focused on climate and by the time it shows results, right? And usually this period could be long. It could be anywhere between a decade to multiple decades, right? Whereas we today are living in an age of instant gratification, right? We want things to happen now. If you are feeling hot in the morning, we want to go and buy an AC in the evening. We will not even think about changing our lifestyle so that, in future there is less heat, right? And this is not only with individuals, it's also with companies. Companies today are governed by stock markets, and stock markets every 3 months they want companies' profit and loss statement. So companies are therefore motivated to make investments in areas which can give them quick revenue and quick results, right? Whereas climate, on the other hand, will require investments which will be a cost for some time and later may kind of lead to profits, but at least for the short term, it'll be a cost. But companies are not willing to invest in that. Same way, if you look at governments, uh, our governments are run by politicians. Politicians come to office for 4 years, 5 years term. And when they come, the expectation is that they will deliver growth. They will show us development. They will do good things for us, right? And the way politicians are able to demonstrate that is by building roads, building buildings, various other developmental projects. uh, they don't focus on climate because climate is not going to show results immediately. So even from politicians, you will see a lot of lip service, but very little action. So they will not put money into climate projects. And when they don't put money, the state doesn't put as much money into climate, this thing, obviously climate action will suffer. So I think these are the fundamental problems. And the other two, I would also say, is because the world realized climate as a problem only around 30, 40 years back. So our response in terms of technologies that can address it is also relatively uh, young, right? So technology is developing, but more importantly, the biggest problem is finance, right? There doesn't seem to be enough money that people, organizations, or governments are willing to dedicate to climate change. And for climate, because technologies need to be developed, projects need to be developed, money is required. So I think those are some of the problems. Say,
Now, coming back to the last point that you mentioned about climate financing, recently it was said that the World Bank lost track of 24 billion or up to 41 billion of climate funds that were allocated. Now, this is billion, Baba billion, not Mama million. How you would think that a cause like this would require more attention. Everybody is affected by it, so ergo funds that go into it would be looked at more closely or so on. But it looks like there is some sort of problem here. And what do you think is an issue?
so I learned about it just this morning, about this issue. Certainly, it's an issue that needs to be investigated. I'm not fully aware of it, but on the face of it, looks like that there could be the confusion is coming because of the accounting methods or reporting methods being used by the World Bank. It seems that the World Bank reports its climate finance based on the disbursements it makes, right? So if a climate project is there and it requires, let's say, $100 million, and the World Bank gives $100 million, they will report as $100 million gone into climate finance. Whereas in reality, whether that 100 million was actually used for climate finance or for something else, the World Bank, it looks like, from what I just read this morning, doesn't keep track of that. right? Or doesn't report that. And there are some agencies like the Oxfam, which have investigated and recently reported that the actual amount of finance that went into climate projects was much lower than what the World Bank has reported. So I think it's an issue of reporting standards. I will not really comment on it and leave it for the World Bank and others to figure that out. But I do want to mention that in most of the climate projects, or for especially when it comes to climate finance, measurement, reporting, and verification are still issues because it's relatively a new field. So the systems for measuring the progress, for verifying it, are still kind of in their infancy. And I think we all, as a community, need to focus on strengthening the MRV so that the confidence of people who are investing in climate projects goes up. Because if today it's World Bank, tomorrow if other such reports come, people who are investing in climate will stop investing because they lose the trust in it. So to make sure that the trust is maintained, I think this whole concept of MRV needs to be strengthened.
Do you see that that process, the MRV process, being refined?
Oh
Is it
yes, absolutely. So earlier it was being done manually, and therefore there were discrepancies in it. I think there are a lot of smart entrepreneurs and technologists and policy people working to make MRV more technology dependent so that the human biases and the human error doesn't come in that. So satellites are being used, sensors are being used. So I definitely see it, coming on control. Yeah.
now your book is about the science and the politics behind climate change. Now, coming to the politics bit, you've made a mention about this rise in muscular nationalism around the world. There is Mr. Orban, Mr. Erdogan, Mr. Putin, and Mr. Modi to an extent, who are country first people, and the electorate seems to like it. And then you've made a mention that countries that have used energy and resources to progress can't now stop other countries from using these resources to better their lives. And there is a direct reflection of this on the electorate, because the electorate votes politicians into power to make their life better. So, how do you think politicians can balance this and the exigencies of climate change?
Sure. In our society, politicians are supposed to be the torch bearers in a manner that they understand the needs of the people, they address the needs of the people, and they also understand what's happening in the outside world generally, right? So, till very recently, the common man didn't understand climate very well. The politicians did, right? But politicians could afford to ignore because their voters weren't asking for it, right? And what happens to the earth or world didn't matter to them as long as they were pleasing their voters by way of showing development or giving them some freebies and other things. So they could continue and climate could be ignored. Things are changing, right? The voters have become smart. Uh, Climate as a threat is now the message is kind of going to the common man, right? And there is a groundswell where people are saying, are hopefully beginning to ask their politicians, what are you doing about it, right? Because if you look at nature, nature has been ringing its alarm bells every so often. You know, heat waves have become so common, droughts are common, cloud bursts, floods are common, sea level is rising, and ordinary man is concerned today, right? And I think this concern of ordinary voters will get translated into action for the politicians. And it's our responsibility sitting here to make sure that the politicians understand the voice of people right now. That's one part of it. The second part of it is that, there is, even at the political side, the action has started. That's how IPCC was formed and the Paris Agreement happened. And though people criticize the Paris Agreement, but I think it's a wonderful thing. It's a common platform where the world has come together. People who've been polluting uh, the atmosphere with carbon dioxide, as well as least developed nations who've traditionally not been polluting, all have come together, recognizing it as a problem and saying we need to do something about it. And each country voluntarily has come up, obviously prodded and encouraged by the Paris Agreement, and is committing to what are called the NDCs, or the nationally determined contribution, that this is the amount of carbon dioxide or greenhouse gases that we will reduce. Now, whether they are actually fulfilling their commitments or not still needs to be seen, right? But at least they are coming together to do that. But it's not a very simple problem to solve, right? Um, if you look at any typical country's budget, government's budget, a reasonable portion of their revenue comes from fossil fuels. And this is true not only of countries which are oil producing countries, even in India, we are not a traditional oil or gas producing country, but 18% of the government's revenue today comes from fossil fuels, coal, oil, gas, right? And this comes by way of customs duty, uh, taxes, uh, profits that the oil companies share with the government, various other this thing. So imagine if tomorrow the Indian government says we are not going to have any fossil fuels, they will lose 18% of the revenue. How will the government run, right? Where are they going to pay for education from? Where are they going to pay for health from? So it's not a very easy decision for the governments. They have to balance, right? So they'll only have to bring it down, reduce the consumption of fossil fuels slowly, so that in the meantime, they are building up alternate sources of revenue. And it doesn't stop there, right? If today we say, no fossil fuels and climate change is important and we need to go all out for it. So uh, all our power we are going to shift to renewable. That requires a lot of investment. Where is the investment going to come from? We don't have that much of money. The developed world is not willing or capable of giving that money, right? So it's a complex problem to solve politically as well. You
Yeah. So next is a naughty question, but don't answer it. Trump or Harris? Don't answer. But do you think if Mr. Trump is elected, as everyone fears, there'll be a rollback in the United States' position on climate change?
I think there could be, but I don't think it'll make a dent, right? Trump or comes or not, it's immaterial because, uh, as we saw in the last tenure of Trump, the moment he came in, he announced that they are going to be moving out of the Paris Agreement, right? But many of the US states and even private organizations stood against him and said, no, we will still follow the tenets of the Paris Agreement. And they did, right? Uh, that was 7 years back. And in 7 years, the world has kind of seen many more catastrophes of climate change and is better convinced uh, that there is a need to address climate change. So even if he comes, he may make some noise. But you know, I've spent some time in the US. I think a large population, the well-thinking population of that country, the organizations seem to be committed to at least doing their bit on climate. So um, it will certainly cause some short-term hiccups, but I think we will roll it. Yeah.
Thank you. I think we are getting down to our last two questions before we open it to the audience. In your book, you mentioned that one of the greatest, the biggest user of fossil fuels is for power generation, 64% or so. And the second is from vehicular pollution. Um, so when we talk about vehicles in India, we are seeing that the excitement for electric vehicles is not what it used to be. Perhaps there is a bit of range anxiety and about technology and so on. Yet in your book, you're very hopeful that we will be 100% electric, at least in the passenger car segment, we will be. What makes you so hopeful? One. And two, there is this question about rare earths being used for this industry. How do you think that mining issue will be solved?
Sure. Uh, so what makes me hopeful is, and I'll give you an example and then I'll answer this question. If you saw 15, 20 years back, the solar power and the wind power, um, they were very expensive and therefore not being implemented, right? Uh, and today, the cost of solar and wind is even lower than coal generated power. So, governments, organizations are really lapping it up and implementing them. Uh, Fortunately or unfortunately, a lot of the decisions the world takes are based on economics, right? As the price comes down, the implementation curve starts going up, right? Same thing happened with solar and wind. They were expensive. Then some governments or organizations took the bold step and said, no, we are going to implement them. And as volumes started building up, the cost came, very uh, sharply down. And as the cost has now become lower than thermal, we are galloping and implementing. I think the same will happen with EVs as well. There is so much of focus on that, and governments have been giving some incentives so that the cost to people is levelized or even lower than the traditional vehicles, and therefore there are incentives for people to go for EVs, right? If today I was to buy a car, um, I'll buy the cheap if they are both same in functionality. Um, a petrol-driven car and an EV, I may buy a petrol-driven car if it's cheaper. But tomorrow, if the EV becomes cheaper, I will definitely switch over. And I think that kind of flip is happening, right? As the volumes pick up. So that's what makes me hopeful. Your second question was that uh, even today there are some ills around EVs. They're not necessarily solving the climate problem today because EVs still need power to charge the batteries. And as long as that power is coming from thermal power plants or coal fired power plants, they are still emitting carbon dioxide. So all we are doing is shifting the carbon dioxide from the tailpipe of the vehicle to the chimney of the this thing, which is true actually, you know. But what we are doing is we are solving for the future. If we start bringing in electric vehicles today, right? And on the other hand, as we briefly referred to, we are transitioning the sources of power generation from thermal to renewable, right? Both of these will meet at a point, right? Uh, I mean, if I was to describe it, um, the whole strategy is that all the endpoints or all the final gadgets or machines or vehicles that use fossil fuel today should be converted to electric, right? And that's one aspect. And on the other, the electricity generation will be transitioned or shifted to renewables, right? So we are starting at both sides of the problem, right? We are changing the endpoints to electric, and they're shifting the electricity generation to renewable so that they go and meet halfway, right? So, because otherwise, if we wait for electricity to get fully renewable and then start transitioning, vehicles to electric, it will take double the time, right? And we don't have that much of time, right? The other issue you brought about is electric vehicles use batteries, and batteries use some of the rare uh, materials like lithium, cobalt, uh, copper, many others, which are very, very polluting and um, energy intensive, right? So manufacturing a battery itself takes a lot of carbon, and disposing of even takes more. But the way technology is moving, a lot of scientists, entrepreneurs are working to address this issue. And I was just sharing with Mathew just while we were walking here that around 5, 6 years back, I had just done a Google search to see how much of cobalt is used in a typical lithium ion battery. And Google told me it's around 20% of the mass of the battery. And just 2 days back, I Googled again to see how much of cobalt is used. And the answer was 2%. So the technology curve has moved to reduce the dependence on cobalt, which is a very polluting metal. Likewise for lithium and others as well. So if I was to take a view, I think in the next 5 to 10 years, these materials, their percentage in the batteries will go down. Also, batteries are becoming recyclable, and their lives are being, uh, enhanced. So hopefully, this becomes a non-issue. You know,
Thank you. This is my last question to you. Is you've been a tech entrepreneur, and among all the technologies that address climate change, what is it that you personally find most impressive or groundbreaking in recent times? I mean, it might change tomorrow, but as of today, what is it that made you go, wow?
Sure. Uh, the way our lives are moving and our lifestyles are changing, the need for energy is going to multiply, right? As we go more and more into comforts, then right. And my own belief is that even if we transition to the renewables like wind and solar, we will still may not have enough energy. Number one, because the sun doesn't shine all the time and the wind doesn't blow, so there are gaps between demand and supply, and right, that thing. But also, both of these need land, and we aren't making any more of it. So at some point, we'll run into issues. And also, both solar and wind, they create their own problems as well in terms of the material wastage that they will create, right? Um, I know nuclear is a bad word these days. Ever since the Fukushima incident, we've gone into a nuclear winter. But there are some people who've been silently working on nuclear to make it safer and cheaper, right? Bill Gates is one of them. He's been investing hugely into making the current nuclear technology safer and cheaper. And the current nuclear technology we use is the nuclear fission, right? So that may happen. But there's another kid on the block called nuclear fusion, right? In in nuclear fission, what you do is you take an atom and split it. And by splitting the atom, it releases energy. On the other hand, in nuclear fusion, you take two atoms and combine them together, and the mass of the new atom is lower than the two, and therefore that mass gets converted into energy and it releases energy. The best example of nuclear fusion is the sun, right? The sun's energy or heat that we experience and see comes through nuclear fusion reaction that's taking place. So the world has been working on nuclear fusion for the last around 40, 50 years, maybe more. In fact, hydrogen bomb, when it was created, was nuclear fusion. There's a lot of progress that's happened on nuclear fusion. In fact, for the first time in history, uh, just around 2 years back, the Livermore laboratory in Berkeley, they demonstrated that the energy liberated by bringing two atoms together was more than the energy used to bring the two atoms together, because it requires a lot of energy to bring them together. So that was a very positive sign. So I'm very hopeful that nuclear fusion comes in, because it's absolutely safe. Nuclear fission still runs the risk of a chain reaction going out of hand. But in nuclear fusion, there is no risk of chain reaction, because you control the fusion of atoms. So I'm hopeful that I would bet on nuclear fusion to solve our energy needs in the future.
Thank you so much, Mr. Mehta. I think we are at our time. And as said here earlier, yes, questions, it's there. But I'll just thank him and then pass the mic. You know, from Delhi's gray skies to nuclear fusion, we have come all the way. And if it's not too much to ask, please give him a big hand. Thank you so much. Now, if you'll put up your hand, one of the volunteers will bring you a microphone and you can ask your questions. Thank you so much.
Hi, Rajan. First of all, I totally enjoyed your this discussion. My name is Chitranjan, and I am working into climate space for over 10 years. But as a climate activist, so we have done lots of protests in Europe and India, putting pressure on European Union and other world bodies. Now, I have two questions for you. Number one, when it comes to public climate finance, there's a lot of hypocrisy when it comes to the Western world. If you look at the data in the last 150 years, the CO2 emissions mostly have caused 90% has been caused by the developed countries, so-called developed countries. So my question is that when in 2009 there was a Copenhagen meet, which happened, the COP meet happened, and there they committed the developed countries like they will give $100 billion as part of public climate finance. Firstly, they didn't do this for the first 4 5 years. Then they started doing a little bit but those public climate finance have become like a loan body. So they say in media that this is an aid given to Sri Lanka, to Mexico, to Bolivia, or to India. But in reality, they are giving these loans on higher interest rates. And in many cases, or maybe most of the cases, above average market rates. So if you get from bank 6%, they'll charge 8% or 10%. So how to handle this? That's a question to you, to put pressure on them. Number two is that because you're talking about technology, you mentioned Bill Gates, and then there is other guy, Elon Musk also. They all talk a lot about we should focus more on technology, less on changing the lifestyle. We should keep living the kind of lifestyle we're living, and focus just develop some carbon capture machine that sucks all the carbon. But I have a different view on this, so I would like to know from you, do you think technology is the solution and we should focus more on that, or we should change our lifestyle more, like the way we look at the life or the nature? So thank you.
Sure. Yeah. Those are very interesting questions. So on the first one, I agree with you 100%. The developed world has been playing shenanigans, right? Uh, it's not only that that 100 billion or so they had committed, I had presumed would come as untethered finance to be put, additional finance to be put into climate projects. But unfortunately, whatever aid they are giving, the loans they are giving, the private investments that are coming from these countries into our country or any other country, those are being counted as climate finance being provided under the aegis of this corpus that they were to give. Uh, the developed world can keep kind of, banging their doors, thumping the tables, but ultimately they control the purse strings, right? But what I would like to add here is that, you know, uh, climate impacts all of us, the whole world. In fact, it impacts developing countries more than the developed countries. Because, God forbid, if a climate disaster was to strike, and I really hope and pray it doesn't strike anywhere, but if it was to strike the developed world, they have the means, they have the systems, the infrastructure to take care of it and the money to take care of it. We don't, right? We just have nature on our side, right? So therefore, for developing countries, while we should keep asking them for money, uh, we should not stop doing our bit, whichever way we can, on climate action, which also means that rather than just waiting for money or aid to come from the Western governments, we need to look at financial structures that can enable private or public money to come into the climate domain in our countries, right? Ultimately, economics rules the world. It is a sad reality, but it is a reality, right? So I think our focus needs to shift on that, right? Because we cannot afford to suffer climate disasters, right? So, there's a lot one can talk, but I'll stop here. And to your second question of technology versus nature, if everybody can change lifestyles today, I think that'll be the best solution. But the practical answer is we can't, right? Because the world is so dependent and integrated with fossil fuel energy and industry that we can't give up. Tomorrow, imagine if, the oil supplies start, what will happen to the world? There'll be a chaos, and we'll perish any which way if the energy supply stops tomorrow, right? We'll fight, whatever else will happen, right? So completely shifting the lifestyles is not a practical thing in my view. So therefore, a mix of technology and lifestyle change is required. We need to kind of fire from all the cylinders, definitely. And technology is a tricky game, right? Uh, Technology will certainly help us solve the problem like it has in the past. If you remember in the 1950s and 60s, there was a big scare that the world will run out of food, and especially India will run out of food, right? And if you took a static view of things at that point in time, then all your projections would show that yes, we will run out of food. But what that did, raising that alarm, got our scientists, our technologists, our farmers, our entrepreneurs into action. And technology did come to our rescue, right? I have no doubt that even now, technology will come to our rescue. But the challenge with technology is each time it is used to address a problem, it also creates an unknown problem. So it's like riding a tiger, right? So we are riding a tiger, and the moment we can't afford to get down, because the moment we get down, the tiger will swallow us. So one technology after other, I do see a foreseeable future where we will have to kind of keep innovating to be able to solve current day problems. Yeah. Does that answer your question?
Thank you. Here, please, a microphone here in the front. Is there anyone else? Okay, you're number 3. Yes.
Hi, thank you for this conversation. It's much needed, of course. Um, some of the points I wanted to bring up was one of the counterpoints they say about EVs is the mining issue. But a lot of these mines are multi-purpose mines. So cobalt, lithium, the only reason we are scaling them up is because of the scale up in demand. But it is not like we're going into mine primarily for that. And if we compare that to the oil and gas mines, which we have, according to S&P, 1 million oil mines, oil fields, out of which maybe 2,000 to 10,000 are actively being harvested or mined. It's really not much of an argument there on the mining issue. I think in a trade-off kind of setup, it's very clear that EVs are a better trade-off than the other one. That was one of the comments I want to make. The second one was about nuclear coming to India. I would be very concerned. Just because of the track record of Chernobyl, Long Island, Fukushima, even countries that have gold standards for safety cannot ensure that these are taken care of.
Sure.
And so if we think the very fact that we have the refinery in Kochi makes me concerned, living in Kottayam. Yeah, just 2 hours away. Like the effect of a spill there can have a huge impact in Vembanad, in all of our regions. So I don't know if I would trust nuclear with our level of expertise on it.
Sure.
Or,
Sure.
one of the things I do want to highlight, though, is there is hope because the ozone was a similar issue. It was not an instant gratification. We'd have to fight the long fight, and we won against ozone. One interesting case we have is, I think, Richard Cox from the lawyer in Netherlands, who took the case to The Hague and won a decisive battle against the Dutch government and Royal Dutch Oil. And that could be a direction that we could follow in India too, a kind of legal approach to things. And maybe there is something you can comment about this. You know about something, because I know nothing in India about this. Sure. And these were some of the things I wanted to talk about.
Absolutely. Do I have time to answer?
Yes, and there is one more question. If you can keep it all
All right,
brief.
yeah. So I think very good questions. On the first one, really, so to speak, mining is not the issue. The carbon footprint of what you mine, these materials leave is the issue, really. And for cobalt, lithium, and all, the carbon footprint is very, very high, right? But there is hope, as I said, that technology is changing. So their carbon footprint would be reduced, as well as their consumption would be reduced. So we do see some hope there. Your second question was on nuclear. Nuclear fission, as I had mentioned, has always this threat hovering over it of igniting a chain reaction. And it's a chain reaction which kind of leads to disaster. Nuclear fusion doesn't have that issue, right? By far a safe technology. So I think hopefully as it kind of comes out, that should be less of a threat. But still, safety systems and all need to be put. So I would bet on nuclear fusion, not as much on fission. Your third point on legal, this was a famous case called ORDEM, ORGDEM, where they took it to the, and the courts gave a ruling and they asked the Netherlands government to, reduce their emissions by, I think, 25% by 2020. So I think those kind of initiatives need to be taken in every country. And the first, most important legal this thing which we can take in every country, including ours, is hold the government to meet the NDCs that it has committed at the Paris Agreement. Because if we go and commit and don't deliver on them, it's no good for us, right? Today, there's no mechanism to do that. So I think that would be a good starting point.